In the heart of rural Texas, nestled behind a dense line of twisted oak trees, stood the Hooley Mansion, its stately yet decayed silhouette a haunting reminder of an era long gone. Though originally a family home built in the late 1800s, the mansion was converted into a bed and breakfast in the early 1970s by Margaret and John Hooley, a couple with big dreams of transforming the charming old house into a serene retreat for weary travelers. But serenity was not what awaited guests of the Hooley Mansion. Almost immediately, strange incidents began to mar the house's peaceful facade. Guests reported feeling watched, hearing footsteps in empty rooms, and sensing an overwhelming sadness in the air. The locals whispered that the house was cursed, but Margaret and John brushed it off as small-town superstitions. They continued to run their B&B, even as reports of odd happenings continued to increase until the deaths began. The first was a middle-aged businessman, Mr. Albert Rowe, found dead in his room one morning. His eyes were wide open, as though he'd seen something terrifying before his heart finally stopped. Authorities called it a heart attack, and Margaret and John tried to move on. But soon another guest, a young woman named Denise, met a similarly mysterious end. She had been staying in the same room as Mr. Rowe. After Denise's death, guests started to avoid the mansion. Word spread that room 4, where both deaths had occurred, was cursed. Margaret attempted to close the room off to ease the guests' fears, but John, determined to keep the business afloat, continued to book the room secretly, refusing to lose income over what he called a little bad luck. Then came the most chilling event. A group of 4 college students traveling through Texas decided to stay at the Hooley Mansion for a night, lured by the allure of a haunted experience. They requested room 4, much to Margaret's dismay. She begged them to reconsider, but the students brushed it off, laughing as they settled into the room for the night. The next morning, Margaret found herself facing a horror beyond her worst fears. 3 of the 4 students were dead, their bodies twisted in unnatural angles, as though they died trying to escape some invisible force. The 4th, a young woman named Emily, was found alive but catatonic, muttering incoherently about shadows, whispers, and a woman at the end of the bed. Emily, the sole survivor, was taken to the hospital and eventually transferred to a psychiatric facility. Though she recovered physically, she was never able to shake the nightmares, which plagued her for the rest of her life. Her accounts of that night became the stuff of legend, tales of a ghostly woman with hollow eyes, whispering threats and slowly approaching, only to vanish just before dawn. The deaths were ruled unexplained, and with his reputation in ruins, John eventually closed the mansion, abandoning it and leaving it to rot. Margaret, heartbroken and desperate, was said to have wandered into the woods one night, never to be seen again. Today, the Hooley Mansion stands silent, a place of forgotten horrors. Locals claim to see lights flickering in the windows at night, and some swear they've heard whispers carried on the wind when they pass by. The brave few who dare to visit are left with chills, stories of eerie presences, and a single warning: never stay in room 4. A new generation of thrill-seekers and ghost hunters became intrigued by the Hooley Mansion, and as the years passed, tales of the haunted bed and breakfast grew more sinister. Paranormal investigators, fascinated by the alleged room 4 curse, attempted to explore the mansion's mysteries. Most left with stories of eerie sounds, sudden temperature drops, and even glimpses of shadowy figures moving through the halls. The legend of the Hooley Mansion gained notoriety across the paranormal community, drawing the attention of 3 curious souls: Josh, Tessa, and Leo, a team of ghost hunters. The team arrived on a moonlit night, the mansion looming like a dark sentinel against the horizon. Overgrown ivy clung to its brick walls, and the windows appeared as hollow, watchful eyes. With equipment in tow, they entered, stepping into the grand but decayed foyer. Dust clung to every surface, and the smell of mildew hung heavily in the air. "Do you guys feel that?" Tessa whispered as they turned on their flashlights. The beam cut through the thick shadows, illuminating fragments of the mansion's former beauty. She was no stranger to spooky atmospheres, but something about the mansion's silence unnerved her. "Yeah, it feels heavy," Josh replied, shivering as they walked past the old check-in desk where Margaret had once welcomed guests. Their objective was clear: to capture evidence of the hauntings and, if they were brave enough, spend the night in room 4. As they moved further into the mansion, they decided to split up to cover more ground. Josh would take the main floor, exploring the parlor and kitchen, while Leo and Tessa ventured upstairs toward the infamous room. The staircase creaked beneath their weight as they ascended, the floorboards groaning as though protesting their presence. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of their vision, but whenever they turned to look, they found nothing but empty halls. Finally, they reached room 4. Leo held up his camera, recording as he slowly turned the doorknob. The door swung open with a shuddering creak, revealing the room within. It looked like any other guest room: a bed, a dresser, a small armchair by the window, but an unnatural chill lingered in the air. The temperature dropped the moment they stepped inside. "Let's set up here," Tessa whispered, her voice barely audible above the ominous silence. They placed their motion sensors and EMF detector around the room, each one calibrated to detect any unusual disturbances. As they arranged the equipment, they couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. A strange tension settled over them, a low hum that made their skin prickle. "Are you recording?" Leo asked, nodding at Tessa, who held the EVP recorder. She nodded, pressing record. "Is anyone here with us?" she asked softly, her voice steady. First, there was silence. But then, just as they were about to give up and try again, a faint voice crackled through the recorder. "Get out." Leo and Tessa exchanged a wide-eyed glance. The voice was unmistakably feminine, but it sounded fragmented, as though the words were carried from some distant place. "Did you hear that?" Tessa asked, her heart pounding. Leo nodded, a look of excitement mixed with dread on his face. "Let's try again." They continued, asking more questions about the mysterious deaths and the woman whom survivors had reportedly seen. Each time, faint voices replied, sometimes unintelligible, but one phrase repeated over and over. "She waits. She watches, she wait." Meanwhile, downstairs, Josh was exploring the parlor. He ran his fingers over the dust-covered furniture, his flashlight illuminating the faded wallpaper and cracked ceiling. Suddenly, he felt a chill that made his breath fog in the air, despite the warm Texas night. A figure appeared in the corner of his vision, a woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." Josh froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He turned his flashlight toward the corner, expecting the figure to disappear. But there she stood, pale and motionless, her empty eyes locked onto his. She looked almost solid, as though she had simply stepped out of another time, her face a mask of anguish. "Hello," he whispered, barely daring to breathe. But the woman didn't respond. Instead, she raised a hand, pointing toward the staircase. He felt a strange compulsion to follow her, his legs moving almost against his will. As he approached, she backed away, slowly ascending the stairs, her form flickering like an image on an old, broken television. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the mansion itself were trying to trap him. Upstairs, Tessa and Leo were still in room 4, reviewing the latest EVP recordings, their faces growing pale as they heard the faint whispers looped back on the recording. "She waits. She watcha." Then they heard footsteps approaching. They assumed it was Josh, but something about the sound wasn't right. The footsteps were slow, uneven, each step landing with a hollow echo that made their stomachs twist. The footsteps stopped right outside the door to room 4, and the doorknob began to turn slowly. Tessa held her breath, her eyes locked on the doorknob. She grabbed Leo's arm, and they both braced themselves as the door creaked open, but no one was there. A chill spread through the room, colder than anything they had felt before. Tessa's flashlight flickered, and she could see her breath in the air. She felt a pressure on her chest, as if something were pressing down on her. Leo, wide-eyed, backed toward the window, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the wall. Then, faintly, they heard a voice, a woman's soft, mournful whisper, emanating from somewhere within the walls. The sound was indistinct, a jumble of words overlapping like an echo trapped in time. But one phrase came through clearly. They shouldn't have stayed. Leo's camera captured a shadow moving across the room, darting from one corner to the next before disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Tessa turned, only to catch a glimpse of a figure, the same woman who had been described by so many before, her hollow eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made Tessa's blood run cold. A chill hit them as the woman's form approached. She extended a hand, her fingers thin and bony, reaching out as if to touch them. Tessa felt a sharp, icy pain as if something invisible were clawing at her wrist. She yelped, pulling her arm back, and looked down to see 3 faint scratches forming on her skin. Suddenly, Josh burst into the room, his face pale and eyes wide with terror. "We have to go," he gasped. "There's something in this house, and it wants us gone." But as he turned to lead them out, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, locking them inside. The temperature dropped even further, and the lights went out, plunging them into pitch darkness. Panic surged as they scrambled for their flashlights, each one flickering uselessly against the oppressive blackness. Then they heard it, a soft, rhythmic sound, like something dragging across the floor just outside the door. It grew louder, closer, filling the silence with a deep, menacing resonance. Leo fumbled for the door handle, desperately pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The dragging sound stopped right outside, and they all held their breath, waiting. A low whisper seeped through the cracks, the voice so close that they could feel it vibrating in the walls. "They'll never leave." Just then, a sharp click echoed in the dark, the sound of the door unlocking. Leo yanked it open, and they stumbled into the hallway, only to find the entire mansion enveloped in darkness, save for a faint, unnatural glow seeping from the staircase, leading downward. With no other option, they began to descend, each step echoing like a heartbeat as the glow drew them deeper into the house. The mansion seemed alive, its walls breathing, its shadows pulsing. They descended the stairs slowly, the dim glow seeming to lead them toward the basement door at the far end of the hall. It was ajar as if inviting them in. The faint light spilled out from within, casting distorted shadows that moved and flickered along the walls, taking on grotesque, shifting shapes. Josh hesitated at the threshold, feeling a sudden dread twist in his stomach. "Maybe we should, I don't know, regroup," he suggested, his voice trembling. But Tessa shook her head, her eyes locked on the eerie glow. "No. Whatever it is, it's down there, and we need to find out what it wants." With a steadying breath, they stepped inside, the basement air thick and stale. The room seemed to stretch into impossible dimensions, walls curving inward at odd angles, distorting reality. Old furniture, relics of the house's past, lay scattered around, covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room, an old mirror stood, its glass cloudy and cracked, reflecting faint images that seemed out of sync with the room around it. Leo raised his flashlight, its beam flickering across the mirror's surface. As the light hit the glass, an image began to emerge, a hazy vision of the woman in the gown, her expression twisted in pain, her hollow eyes staring out of the mirror's depths. "Do you see her?" Tessa whispered, gripping her flashlight tighter. The woman seemed to be mouthing something, her lips moving slowly, forming words they couldn't quite make out. Then suddenly the room felt colder. The sound of soft footsteps echoed behind them. Josh whipped around, his heart racing, but saw nothing but shadows shifting in the darkness. A faint whisper filled the air, growing louder until it filled the entire basement, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "Why did you come?" The question reverberated through the room, chilling them to the bone. The woman in the mirror seemed to grow clearer, her expression more urgent, her hand pressing against the glass as if trying to reach through. The edges of the mirror began to tremble, the glass vibrating, and the glow in the room intensified, casting everything in an eerie, otherworldly light. As they watched in horrified fascination, a series of images flashed across the mirror's surface. Margaret and John Hooley, their faces contorted in fear, standing in this very basement. Then, the vision shifted, showing guests those who had died here over the years, each trapped in the same paralyzed terror. The images cycled faster, becoming more frantic, a whirlwind of horror spiraling toward a single figure. The woman from room 4. "She's trapped," Tessa murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "All of them are. This house, it's holding them here." Leo took a step back, his gaze fixed on the mirror, watching as the woman's face came into focus, her eyes filling with a silent, desperate plea. She mouthed one final word, a warning, as her hand pressed harder against the glass. "Leave." But before they could react, the mirror cracked, a spiderweb of fractures racing across the glass as a burst of cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. In the pitch-black darkness, they heard something shifting, moving toward them, a low, guttural growl echoing from the shadows. Panicking, they scrambled for the stairs, but the basement door slammed shut, trapping them in the darkness. Josh felt something brush against his arm, cold and sharp, and he stumbled back, colliding with Tessa. "Where do we go?" Leo shouted, his voice barely audible above the growing noise. A cacophony of whispers and footsteps circling them, pressing closer. The glow reappeared, this time seeping from the cracks in the walls, illuminating strange symbols that pulsed with a dark energy. The mirror shook violently, and the cracks deepened, spilling out a shadowy mist that began to take form, twisting and coiling around them. They backed into a corner, their flashlights flickering back to life just long enough to reveal the woman, her hollow eyes staring into theirs with an almost sorrowful intensity. She raised her hand, reaching out, her face a mask of grief and warning. The whispers grew louder, filling their minds with fragmented words, pieces of stories long forgotten, the cries of those who had perished here. Just as the mist began to close in around them, suffocating and dense, the woman's whisper cut through the chaos, clear and resonant. "Run." At the sound of her final plea, Josh, Tessa, and Leo sprang into action, adrenaline and fear propelling them toward the basement door. They fumbled in the darkness, clawing at the wood until finally, miraculously, it flew open, letting in a sliver of moonlight from the hallway. They scrambled out, slamming the door behind them, and bolted up the stairs, their breath ragged as they raced for the front door. Just as they reached it, an invisible force yanked it shut, trapping them once more. Desperate, Leo threw his shoulder into it, and with one final, panicked push, the door burst open, releasing them onto the overgrown lawn. They stumbled down the front steps, gasping as the weight of the mansion's dark energy lifted the moment they crossed its threshold. Outside, the house loomed silently, its dark windows watching them, and for a moment, they could still hear the faint whisper of the woman from room 4, "Thank you, go." The three of them didn't look back as they raced to their car, fumbling to get inside, hearts still racing. Only when they sped away, the mansion shrinking in the distance, did they feel some semblance of safety. Silence filled the car, punctuated only by the occasional shuddering breath, until finally, Josh spoke up. Did we really see that?" Leo and Tessa exchanged a glance, their faces still pale, a haunted look in their eyes. "I don't know," Tessa murmured, "but we're never going back there." Days later, they reviewed the footage, hoping to understand what they had encountered. But every recording from that night, every EVP, every video, every photograph was corrupted, filled with static and strange distortions. Only one frame was clear, a single image of the woman from room 4, her empty, pleading eyes staring back at them from the screen. They never spoke of the Hooley Mansion again, but the experience haunted each of them, appearing in their dreams and lurking in their minds. They knew they had been spared, warned by a trapped soul, but the house itself with its dark secrets and cursed room for waited still, watching, ready to trap the next curious souls who dared to enter. And on quiet Texas nights, the locals swear they can still see a faint glow from the basement window and hear a woman's whisper on the wind, begging for freedom, trapped forever within the walls of the Hooley haunted mansion. Years after Josh, Tessa, and Leo narrowly escaped, the Hooley Mansion remained abandoned, its reputation as a cursed place growing into a local legend. Curious onlookers would occasionally drive by, But none dared enter the shadowy house until one chilly October evening, when a new group of thrill-seekers arrived. The newcomers were a paranormal investigation team from a popular online channel that specialized in proving haunted locations to be hoaxes. They'd heard the stories, watched what little footage remained from previous explorers, and felt confident they'd debunk yet another myth. Their leader, Marcus, was determined to disprove the haunting once and for all, and he boasted to his audience in a live stream that he would spend the night in room 4. Armed with state-of-the-art equipment and live feeds to thousands of viewers, the team entered the Hooley Mansion with an air of skepticism, laughing off every creak and draft as theatrics of an old house. They set up cameras in every room and joked about how they would finally put this legend to rest. But as the night wore on, the playful mood dissolved. Doors began slamming shut, shadows crept along the edges of their vision, and their viewers started commenting on strange figures moving in the background of the feed. The air grew cold, colder than it should have been on a Texas night, and the house took on an unnatural silence, as though waiting. In room 4, Marcus set up his sleeping bag with a camera directly facing him, but his bravado was faltering. He felt the weight of the room pressing down, the oppressive energy making him feel trapped. He tried to ignore it, narrating for the camera, until a sudden, loud bang sounded from the corner. He turned, seeing nothing but feeling a presence, watching. Suddenly, a static hiss filled the live feed, and the thousands of viewers watching saw Marcus go rigid, his gaze fixed on the mirror. They watched in horror as the mirror began to fog, words forming as though someone were writing from the other side. "Leave now." Marcus's expression turned to terror. He stood, trying to make his way to the door, but it slammed shut before he reached it, sealing him inside. The feed cut in and out, showing flashes of Marcus banging on the door, then slumping to his knees as a shadowy figure loomed over him. A woman's whisper echoed, faint but clear, "They never leave." The live feed abruptly went dark, leaving thousands of horrified viewers in stunned silence. The remaining team members, still downstairs, were oblivious to the events unfolding in room 4. But when they finally tried to find Marcus, they discovered only an empty room. No trace of him remained, save for a faint chill and the faint outline of a woman's handprint pressed against the mirror. Days passed, and Marcus was never found. His team abandoned the channel, refusing to speak of what had happened, and the live footage of that night was mysteriously erased from the internet. Locals say that, on certain nights, you can still hear Marcus's frantic whispers and see his face flickering in the mansion's windows, pleading for escape, joining the echoes of those lost souls who came before him. The Hooley Mansion remains empty, shrouded in mystery, its doors now locked tight, as if even the walls have grown tired of their own dark secrets. Yet some say that every year, on the anniversary of that final, fateful investigation, the faint glow in room 4 reappears, a warning and an invitation for the next daring soul who thinks they can conquer the mansion's curse. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.